Picture this: between March 2020 and March 2022, the Federal Reserve created more money than existed in the entire United States economy in 2008. $4.5 trillion conjured from nothing, with the click of a mouse. No printing presses, no gold reserves, no congressional approval for each transaction, just created. Now here's the part that should terrify you. That wasn't a gift. It was theft, and the amount stolen. Roughly 30% of everything you'd saved, everything you'd worked for, everything sitting in your bank account. Gone, not to a burglar in a mask, but to a process so subtle, so sophisticated, that most people don't even realize they've been robbed. So here's the question that should be keeping you up at night. If someone could steal 30% of your wealth without breaking into your home, without hacking your accounts, without even touching your money, would you call it theft? Or would you call it monetary policy? Welcome to the Economic Philosopher, where we explore the uncomfortable intersections of money, power, and human nature that everyone talks around but nobody wants to confront directly. That question I just asked isn't rhetorical. It's the central tension of modern economic life, and it reveals something profound about the nature of money, value, and the social contract we've all unknowingly signed. Because when the Federal Reserve expanded the money supply by unprecedented amounts during the COVID-19 pandemic, they didn't just stimulate the economy or provide liquidity to markets. Those are the comfortable euphemisms we use. What they actually did was execute the largest wealth transfer in modern American history. And they did it using a mechanism so abstract that most victims still don't understand what happened to them. Today, we're going to dissect this theft and, yes, I'm deliberately using that word from multiple angles. We'll explore the historical precedents that warned us this was coming, examine the philosophical questions about what money really is and who has the right to create it, dive into the psychological mechanisms that make us blind to this form of robbery, and analyze the economic mechanics that turned your purchasing power into someone else's asset appreciation. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just what happened to your money, but why it happened, who benefited, and most importantly, why this pattern keeps repeating throughout history and will likely happen again. This isn't just about the Fed's actions during COVID. This is about understanding the fundamental structure of modern monetary systems and your place within them. Let's begin with a story that might sound familiar. The year is 1923, Weimar, Germany. A woman wheels a wheelbarrow full of cash, literally millions of marks, to buy a loaf of bread. She leaves the wheelbarrow outside the bakery for just a moment. When she returns, the money is dumped in the street and the wheelbarrow is gone. The thief didn't want the money. The wheelbarrow was more valuable. This is the iconic image of hyperinflation, the nightmare scenario every economist warns about. But here's what they don't tell you. This didn't happen overnight. It happened through a series of decisions that, at each step, seemed reasonable, necessary, even compassionate. The German government needed to pay war reparations. They needed to support their economy. They needed to help their citizens. So they printed money, and then they printed more and more. The pattern is ancient. Roman emperors didn't have printing presses, but they had something just as effective. They debased their currency by reducing the silver content in their coins. Emperor Nero, around 60 AD, reduced silver content from 100% to 93%. Sounds modest, right? But within 2 centuries, Roman coins contained less than 5% silver. The empire could fund its armies, its building projects, its bread and circuses. But the wealth of ordinary Romans evaporated. What connects these historical episodes to 2020 isn't just the act of money creation, it's the justification. Every government that has expanded its money supply drastically has done so claiming emergency, necessity, and the greater good. And technically, they're not lying. But here's the philosophical trap. When you give someone the power to create money, you give them the power to redistribute wealth without taxation, without legislation, without any of the normal democratic processes we've built to protect property rights. John Locke, the philosopher, whose ideas heavily influenced the American founding fathers, argued that property rights were natural rights as fundamental as life and liberty. You own what you create, what you earn, what you trade for. But what happens to property rights when someone can simply create the medium of exchange? This is the deep historical lesson. Inflation is never just an economic phenomenon. It's always a political tool, a means of transferring resources from those who hold currency to those who control its creation, or those who receive it first. The Romans called it debasement, medieval kings called it singerage, modern economists call it monetary policy. But the effect is identical. Those with political power take from those with economic savings. Here's where it gets interesting for our current situation. The Weimar hyperinflation is always invoked as a cautionary tale, but it's the wrong comparison for what happened in 2022. Weimar was a complete systemic collapse. What we experienced and are still experiencing is more insidious. It's what economist Murray Rothbard called camouflaged confiscation. The theft is large enough to transfer enormous wealth, but small enough that most people rationalize it away. 20 to 30% inflation over 2 to 3 years. That's uncomfortable, annoying, even painful. But it's not wheelbarrows full of worthless cash. It's not hyperinflation. So we don't revolt. We don't demand accountability. We just accept it. We tighten our belts, we complain about grocery prices, and we move on. And that acceptance is exactly what makes it such an effective tool. Consider the historical pattern. Moderate inflation is how empires slowly transfer wealth from the productive class to the political class without triggering revolution. It's the taxation you don't see coming. The theft that does unfeel like theft until years later when you realize your retirement savings by half of what you planned for. Let's get uncomfortable for a moment. What is money? Ask 100 people. And you'll get 100 variations of it's what we use to buy things. But that's like saying a map is that thing you use to find places, true, but missing the deeper point. Money is a claim on future goods and services. It's stored labor, stored time, stored human energy, and creativity. When you have $1,000 in your bank account, you don't have paper or digital ones, and zeros you have a claim on society's productive output equal to whatever $1,000 can buy. Now here's the critical insight. When someone creates new money, they're not creating new claims on goods that don't exist. They're diluting every existing claim. It's as if everyone holding a ticket to a concert suddenly found out that the venue doubled the number of tickets sold. Your ticket doesn't get you any closer to the stage. The venue owners made money by selling more tickets, but your concert experience just got worse. And crucially, you didn't consent to this arrangement. This is where we enter genuinely controversial philosophical territory. The philosopher Robert Nozick argued that justice in holdings comes from just acquisition and just transfer. You justly acquire property through your labor or through voluntary exchange. Theft violates justice because it's an involuntary transfer. So let's apply this framework to inflation. You acquired your dollars justly through your labor, through your business, through voluntary exchange. When the Federal Reserve expands the money supply, they execute an involuntary transfer of your purchasing power. The medium changes. Instead of someone taking your physical dollars, they're reducing what those dollars can claim. But the effect is identical. You have less, someone else has more, and you didn't agree to the transaction. The counterargument is that you implicitly agreed by using fiat currency in the first place. By accepting dollars, you accepted the rules of the dollar system, which includes central bank discretion over the money supply. This is the social contract argument. You consented by participating. But did you really? Can you opt out of the dollar system while remaining in American society? Can you pay your taxes in gold or Bitcoin or wheat? Can you legally refuse to accept dollars for debts? No. The dollar has legal tender laws backing it, tax obligations requiring it, and a massive infrastructure built around it. Calling participation in this system voluntary is like saying your participation in having a government is voluntary because you could theoretically move to another country. Technically true, but practically absurd for most people. This brings us to the philosopher Bastiat's concept of legal plunder. Frederick Bastiat argued that the law can be perverted from its proper purpose of protecting property into a tool for plundering property. Legal plunder is when the law itself takes from one person what belongs to them and gives it to another. And here's his key insight. Just because something is legal doesn't make it just. Slavery was legal. Confiscation of Jewish property in Nazi Germany was legal. The fact that Federal Reserve policy is legal tells us nothing about whether it's just. So we're left with a genuine philosophical dilemma. Is inflation theft, or is it simply the cost of participating in a modern monetary system? I'll offer you this framework. If I take your physical wallet, that's theft. If I pass a law that says everyone must give me 10% of their wallet's contents, and I have the power to enforce that law, we call that taxation legal, but still a forced transfer. If I create a system where the value of what's in your wallet decreases by 10% while I benefit from that decrease, and I make it practically impossible for you to opt out of having your wealth in that wallet, what do we call that? The philosophical sophistication of monetary inflation is that it abstracts theft through multiple layers of complexity. There's no single moment where you can point and say that's when you robbed me. It's dispersed across time, across millions of transactions, across complex mechanisms like quantitative easing and federal funds rates and treasury bond purchases. But distribution and complexity don't change the fundamental nature of the transaction. Here's the most important philosophical point. The burden of proof should be on those who claim it's not theft, not on those who claim it is. If I'm going to take something that belongs to you, the default assumption should be that I need your explicit, informed consent. The fact that our monetary system assumes consent, unless you opt out and makes opting out nearly impossible, reveals something deeply troubling about the power dynamics embedded in the architecture of modern money. Now we need to understand why this theft is so effective. Why don't people revolt? Why isn't there mass outrage? The answer lies in the psychology of how we perceive value, time, and causation. First, there's what psychologists call the money illusion, a term coined by economist Irving Fisher and later explored extensively by behavioral economists like Daniel Kahneman. The money illusion is our tendency to think about wealth in nominal terms rather than real terms. If your salary increases from $50,000 to $55,000, you feel richer, even if inflation means you can buy less than before. Your brain sees $55,000 and compares it to $50,000 and concludes you're doing better. But the number is deceiving you. This isn't stupidity, it's a fundamental feature of how human cognition works. Our brains evolved to think in concrete terms. 3 apples, 5 sheep, 10 arrows. We didn't evolve to intuitively understand abstract concepts like purchasing power or real versus nominal values. Those require conscious, effortful thinking that most people don't apply to everyday financial decisions. Second, there's the attribution error in causation. When prices go up, we blame the grocery store, or the gas station, or corporate greed. These are visible, immediate, and easy to understand. The grocery store raised prices. Obviously, they're the problem, right? But this is like blaming your thermometer for the heat. Stores are responding to a change in the underlying monetary environment. The money supply increased, so prices adjust upward. But this process is invisible, abstract, and disconnected in time from the money creation event. When did the Fed print the money? March 2020. When did your grocery bill notably increase? Mid-2021, throughout 2022, into 2023. The gap between cause and effect is long enough that most people never make the connection. You can see the price increase. You can't see the money supply expansion that caused it, so you blame what you can see. There's a deeper psychological principle at work here called diffusion of responsibility. The theft isn't committed by a person with a face and a name who broke into your house. It's committed by a complex institutional process involving Federal Reserve governors, Treasury officials, congressional authorization, bond market mechanisms, and banking system intermediaries. When responsibility is diffused across many actors and complex systems, our moral intuitions struggle to assign blame. It feels wrong, but we can't point to the wrongdoer. Compare this to direct taxation. If the government said we're taking 30% of your savings account tomorrow, you'd be outraged. You'd know exactly who did it, when they did it, and how much they took. But when inflation takes 30% of your purchasing power over 3 years, through a complex monetary mechanism most people don't understand, it just feels like life got more expensive. It's frustrating, but it doesn't trigger the same moral outrage as direct confiscation. This is what makes inflation such an effective political tool. It's politically invisible theft. Politicians can authorize enormous spending, the Federal Reserve can finance it through money creation. And by the time citizens feel the pain of inflation, the causal chain is so complex and time-delayed that anger disperses rather than focuses. There's no accountability because there's no clear moment of theft to point to. Kahneman and Tversky's prospect theory gives us another insight. Humans are loss-averse, but we evaluate losses based on reference points. If you have $100 and someone takes $50, you feel that loss acutely. But if over 3 years your $100 slowly buys less and less until it effectively has the purchasing power of $70, you don't experience that as a loss of $30. You experience it as prices increasing, as needing to be more careful with money, as life getting harder. The loss is real, but the psychology of how we experience it is completely different. There's also the just world hypothesis. Our psychological need to believe that the world is fundamentally fair and that bad things happen for good reasons. When confronted with the idea that the monetary system itself is structured to transfer their wealth, many people resist this conclusion because it's destabilizing. It's more psychologically comfortable to believe that inflation is just an unfortunate side effect of necessary policies than to believe it's a feature, not a bug, a wealth transfer mechanism built into the system itself. Finally, there's the availability heuristic. We judge the likelihood or importance of something based on how easily we can recall examples. Can you easily recall examples of theft? Sure, news stories about burglaries, robberies, fraud. Can you easily recall examples of wealth transfer through inflation? It's abstract, statistical, and rarely framed as theft in media coverage. So it doesn't register with the same psychological weight, even when the monetary impact is vastly larger than typical property crimes. The psychology here is brutal. We're systematically blind to one of the largest threats to our financial well-being, not because we're stupid, but because the threat is designed, whether intentionally or through institutional evolution, to exploit the fundamental limitations and biases of human cognition. Now we get to the technical mechanics. How exactly does creating $4.5 trillion translate into theft? Who benefits? Who loses? And through what mechanisms? This is where we need to understand the Cantillon effect. Named after 18th century economist Richard Cantillon, the Cantillon effect describes what happens when new money enters an economy. It doesn't spread evenly like a tide raising all boats. It enters at specific points, and those closest to the entry point benefit most, while those furthest away are harmed most. Here's how it worked in 2022. The Federal Reserve didn't just mail $4.5 trillion to random citizens. They created money and used it to purchase assets, primarily treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities, from banks and financial institutions. This is called quantitative easing. Step 1. The Fed creates digital dollars and buys bonds from major financial institutions. These institutions now have cash instead of bonds. What do they do with this cash? They need to invest it somewhere to generate returns. So they buy other assets: stocks, real estate, corporate bonds, commodities. Step 2. This massive wave of new money entering asset markets drives up asset prices. If you owned stocks, real estate, or other financial assets in 2020, you watched their value soar. The S&P 500 nearly doubled from its March 2020 low to its January 2022 peak. Housing prices surged by over 40% in many markets. If you owned assets, you got much wealthier, not because the underlying companies got 100% more productive or because houses became 40% better, but because there was more money chasing the same assets. Step 3. Meanwhile, if your wealth was primarily in cash savings or fixed income, you received none of this benefit. Worse, as all that new money eventually filtered through the economy, prices for goods and services increased. Your savings bought less, your salary bought less, your fixed income bought less. You became poorer in real terms, while asset holders became richer. This is the Cantillon effect in action. The new money didn't make everyone proportionally richer. It made those closest to the money creation financial institutions, asset holders, the wealthy, richer, while making those dependent on wages and cash savings poorer. Let's put numbers to this. In 2020, the bottom 50% of Americans by wealth held roughly 2% of all stock market wealth. The top 10% held about 88%. When the stock market nearly doubled, that wasn't a broadly shared gain, it was a massive wealth transfer to the already wealthy. Meanwhile, those same bottom 50% held proportionally more of their wealth in savings and checking accounts, which lost purchasing power as inflation accelerated. The Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis published research showing that between 2020 and 2022, the wealth gap in America increased more dramatically than at any point since the 1920s. The wealthy got historically wealthier while real wages declined for most workers. This wasn't an accident or an unfortunate side effect. This is the mathematically inevitable result of how quantitative easing works. Here's another crucial mechanism: debt versus savings. When inflation occurs, debtors benefit and savers are punished. Why? Because debt is typically fixed in nominal terms. If you owe $100,000 on a mortgage and inflation reduces the real value of dollars by 30%, you effectively owe 30% less in real terms. But if you saved $100,000, you can now buy 30% less. The federal government, the largest debtor in history, benefited enormously from this inflation. Their $28 trillion in debt became easier to service. Meanwhile, responsible citizens who saved were punished. This creates a perverse moral hazard. The system punishes prudence and rewards leverage. If you knew inflation was coming, the rational move was to borrow as much as possible and buy assets. If you did the responsible thing and saved cash, you were systematically robbed. This is the opposite of what we teach about financial responsibility, and it's baked into how our monetary system functions during periods of expansion. There's also what economists call the wage-price spiral lag. Prices for goods can adjust quickly. Businesses can raise prices within weeks or months, but wages are sticky. They adjust slowly. Labor contracts might last years. Job changes happen gradually. So there's a period often lasting years where prices have increased, but wages haven't caught up. During this lag period, workers are effectively poorer. Even if wages eventually increase to match inflation, there's been a real wealth transfer during the adjustment period. The data bears this out. Real wages adjusted for inflation declined in 2021 and 2022 for most American workers. Even as nominal wages increased, inflation increased faster. Workers were running on a treadmill that was speeding up, and they called falling behind getting a raise. Now, here's the part that will make some economists uncomfortable. This wasn't an accidental outcome of well-intentioned policy. This was the predictable, inevitable result of how monetary expansion works in a financialized economy. The Fed didn't create money and accidentally favor asset holders. That's simply where new money enters the system when you do quantitative easing. They knew this. They chose to do it anyway. The justification was that without this intervention, the economy would have collapsed, unemployment would have soared, and the damage would have been worse. Maybe that's true, but let's be clear about what that argument really means. We chose to execute a massive wealth transfer from the poor and middle class to the wealthy in order to prevent economic collapse. We chose to rob some people to save the system. That might have been necessary, but let's not pretend it wasn't robbery. So let's tie all of this together. What actually happened between 2020 and 2022? The Federal Reserve, faced with economic crisis, created $4.5 trillion in new money. This was roughly a 40% increase in the money supply in just 2 years, unprecedented in peacetime American history. This new money entered the economy through asset purchases, primarily benefiting financial institutions and asset holders. Asset prices soared, making the wealthy dramatically wealthier. Meanwhile, the increase in money supply eventually filtered through to consumer prices, creating inflation that peaked around 9%, but cumulatively reduced purchasing power by roughly 30% for those holding cash. Wages lagged behind prices, meaning workers got poorer in real terms. Savers were punished while debtors benefited. The result was the largest wealth transfer in modern American history, from wage earners to asset holders, from savers to debtors, from the middle class to the wealthy, and from citizens to the government, whose debt burden was inflated away. Historically, this follows a pattern as old as currency itself, rulers debasing money to fund priorities at the expense of citizens. Philosophically, it raises fundamental questions about property rights, consent, and the legitimacy of state power over money. Psychologically, it exploits our cognitive limitations to execute theft that doesn't feel like theft. And economically, it operates through well-understood mechanisms that predictably transfer wealth to those already wealthy. So what do you do about this? Here are practical takeaways. First, understand that cash is not a safe store of value over long time periods. This doesn't mean don't hold any cash. You need liquidity for emergencies and opportunities. But parking large amounts of wealth in savings accounts for years is effectively choosing to be robbed slowly. Second, Invest in assets that have historically preserved purchasing power during inflation. Real estate, stocks in productive companies, commodities, and yes, increasingly, alternative assets like Bitcoin that have fixed supply schedules. The lesson of 2020 to 2022 is that when money supply expands, you want to hold things money chases, not money itself. Third, be strategically thoughtful about debt. In an inflationary environment, fixed-rate debt on productive or appreciating assets can be beneficial. But this requires disciplined. Debt is dangerous if used for consumption or if you can't service it during economic downturns. Fourth, increase your financial literacy. The complexity of how this theft works is not an accident, it's a feature that protects the system from scrutiny. The more you understand about monetary policy, asset valuation, and real versus nominal returns, the better equipped you are to protect yourself. Fifth, diversify across different economic assumptions. We don't know if the future holds more inflation, deflation, stagflation, or renewed growth. Having exposure to different asset classes that perform well under different scenarios is prudent. Finally, and most importantly, understand that this will happen again. The mechanisms that enabled the 2020 to 2022 wealth transfer are still in place. The Federal Reserve still has the power to expand the money supply. The political incentives that encourage this behavior haven't changed. The next crisis, whether it's another pandemic, a financial crisis, a war, or something we can't predict, will likely trigger another round of monetary expansion. And once again, those who understand how the system works will position themselves to benefit, while those who don't will be robbed without even realizing it. The goal isn't to make you paranoid or angry, though both might be reasonable responses. The goal is to make you informed and prepared. You can't change the system individually, but you can change how you position yourself within it. Let's talk about where we go from here, both as individuals and as a society that needs to grapple with these questions. Drop a comment below. Do you consider what happened between 2020 and 2022 to be theft, or do you think it was necessary economic policy with unfortunate side effects? I want to hear your perspective, especially if you disagree with the framing I've used in this video. The most interesting conversations happen when we actually engage with different viewpoints. If this analysis was valuable to you, hit that subscribe button. This channel exists to explore the uncomfortable intersections of economics, philosophy, and psychology that affect your life, but that most financial content either ignores or oversimplifies. Every week, we go deep on one topic that matters. And if you want to continue this line of thinking, check out my video on the Cantillon effect and why proximity to money creation determines your wealth trajectory in modern economies. It expands on several concepts I touched on here and goes deeper into the historical patterns of monetary manipulation. Here's what I want you to understand as we close. Knowledge is power, but only if you act on it. Understanding how you were robbed matters, but protecting yourself from the next robbery matters more. The system isn't going to change to protect you. You have to change how you operate within the system. This is the Economic Philosopher, where we ask the questions about money and power that make everyone uncomfortable, because comfortable questions don't lead to useful answers. Until next time, stay skeptical, stay informed, and remember, the best way to predict the future is to understand the past and the incentives that drive human behavior.